Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to you all. My name is Abderrahim Foukara from Jazeera. It's a real pleasure to bring this panel to you today about Turkey and the Middle East, and Turkey and the United States. The way we're going to do this, we have until exactly 2:30 to finish this panel. So I'll start with an introduction, just basically setting the parameters of the debate, and then I'll go to each panelist for their introductory comments, which will not exceed 10 minutes each. Then I'll possibly do a round of question and answer with them, and then I'll open it up to your comments and questions. Okay. So let me start by introducing quickly the panelists. We have some, obviously, at least in my book, some very big brains on this panel. Anthony Cordesman, for those of you who live in DC in the US, they obviously know him. Arleigh, Burke Chair in Strategy, Center for Strategic and International Studies. He's sitting right here. At the far end is Burhanettin Duran. He's General Coordinator of the SETA Foundation. Sitting next to him is Shadi Hamid, Fellow Project on US Relations with the Islamic World at the Brookings Institution. And sitting immediately to my left is Andrew Tabler, who is a Senior Fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And if you need more details about their biographies, you can always do your own homework. About 1,400 years ago, the Arabs started spreading Islam outside its Arabian Peninsula cradle. About 10 centuries ago, the Seljuks, a Persian dynasty, began establishing Islam in the region which now constitutes modern Turkey. By the 17th century, the Ottoman Empire, predecessor to modern-day Turkey, helped by Islam and Islamic identity, had taken over many parts of what is today known as the Arab world. Although the Ottoman Empire collapsed several decades ago, it is still recalled fondly by many Arabs, though also resented by others, particularly in places such as Syria, where supporters of Bashar al-Assad suspect Turkey's Islamist leader Recep Tayyip Erdogan of harboring designs to destroy secularism in the region and to revive Ottoman ambition there. However, there are also large numbers of Syrians who see Erdogan as a Turkish hero who is very receptive to their current plight. Turkey had vigorously pursued an ambition to join the membership of the European Union, an ambition that seems to have taken a backseat since 2011, when Erdogan saw an opportunity in the so-called Arab Spring, both for Turkey, but also, as he says, for Arabs from the Gulf to the Atlantic. But as the early democratic hopes of that spring have gradually given way to political chaos, the Turkish pendulum may be gently swinging back towards the stability and democracy of Europe, even with its tepid, if not downright cold shoulder to Turkish ambition to join the European club. Meanwhile, Erdogan continues to speak to Arabs in a language that riles up Arab regimes, such as that of Bashar al-Assad, accused of killing hundreds of thousands of Syrians, and that of Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, accused of militarily toppling a democratically elected president who is now, by the way, facing the death penalty. So what does What does it all mean for Turkey in the Middle East? And what does it all mean for Turkey's relations with its staunch ally, the United States, in light of the cracks that have at times appeared in this strong alliance? Let me start with you, Andrew Tabler. Turkey has problems with, as I said, Egypt and other countries in the region, but Syria sits right there across the border. What does that mean for the future of Turkey's influence in the region as you see it?
Good question. First of all, thank you for that introduction, and thank you to everyone here at SETA for the invitation today. I don't have easy answers to some of these questions, but I think one of the great challenges that confronts Turkey and the United States today is not so much about the response to the Syrian uprising. I think that now is part of diplomatic and perhaps military and security history in the region. The uprising, of course, is still going on, but it's far away from the peaceful uprising that we saw in the beginning of 2011. I think now most of the response concerns both Turkey's view and Washington's view of a corpse of a country. People often ask me, Andrew, what do you do for a living? And I say, I'm a Syria specialist, or I'm a specialist on Syria, or whatever it used to be. The country that I lived in, and many of you, I think, have visited or spent a lot of time, it no longer exists as it did before. It exists on a map. I'm not saying it doesn't have a legal status, because I'm not a lawyer or going to make that argument, but it's just not there. And there are many neighborhoods which are completely not there because of the type of fighting. Dr. Cordesman and I were speaking as we were walking up, and he raised an interesting point that I totally agree with. The problem we have in Syria is there is not one party that can easily retake the reins of control over all of geographic Syria, and I don't see that happening anytime soon. Whether ultimately that will happen years down the road, I don't know. What form that would take, I'm not sure. But right now, in Washington, it's often called a dynamic stalemate. I don't know what exactly to call it. But it is, the country itself has become, the old word was balkanized. I guess some people say it's more like Somalia. I don't know, but it's divided. So I think it's in this situation, which has, I think, has become apparent to decision makers, especially after ISIS's takeover of Mosul, but it was happening before that as well. There's a fundamental difference between Ankara and Washington on how to view the crisis and the sequencing of a response. And I think there's more on the sequencing now, and I think this will continue to be worked out in the coming period. Turkey believes that a solution to the Syria crisis is the Assad regime's removal and the emergence of a government that better represents the Syrian people. And in doing so, this will help put the pieces of Syria back together again, and will somehow take care of the jihadist groups like Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS, which are unfortunately large swaths now, they control large swaths of Syrian territory. Washington shares that same end goal today. I don't meet very many people who say to me, we want Assad to stay. I've never actually met a person say, we want Assad to stay. It's not because of, in the old days, I think the United States would have already shifted back to backing the Assad regime, but the Assad regime doesn't have the manpower or the capacity to retake all of its own territory. So Washington now, I think, fears that while they agree that in the end Assad has to go as part of a comprehensive solution, they fear that the collapse of the Assad regime immediately would only strengthen jihadists and Jabhat al-Nusra. Doesn't mean it would save Syrian lives, doesn't mean, but for these two groups, they are poised to take advantage of that situation. Therefore, the US response has been, and which has put it at odds with Ankara, first degrade ISIS and jihadists and then replace Assad, or more simply put, ISIS first, Assad later. In the context of that discussion, there are big differences that have been worked out or tweaked, And we will see how this evolves. And one of the challenges of the US response to ISIS has been, let's say you want to bomb a checkpoint up near Aleppo, which has 5 guys, or 10 guys, or 20 guys, whatever. And so the planes take off from the Persian Gulf, or the Arab Gulf. They fly up over Iraq, over Syria, bomb their targets, and then have to fly back. Right? That's a long way. That's a very, this is very expensive. It takes a long time. Very frustrating for American policymakers. The United States would like to base its aircraft out of Turkey, out of Incirlik, and other locations to carry out sorties against ISIS. Turkey has said, well, okay, let's talk about that, but we have to talk about the train and equip program and your plans for the Assad regime. There is I think, a dispute over, in terms of what that force's end goal is, or what it is trying to achieve in Syria. The U.S. wants this force, this moderate force, to fight ISIS and extremism, and Turkey, I think, wants it to do that, but also to ultimately replace or displace and perhaps replace the Assad regime. I think both Turkey and the United States agree that this program will support the Syrian moderate opposition, but there are big concerns that I feel that I can pick up, and it's not just I think in Ankara, it's also in U.S. policymaking circles, that the 5,000 trained per year or the 15,000 trained total is hardly enough. It's not a drop in the ocean, but it's maybe only a few drops. And therefore, what good is it really going to do? And where is it going to be able to deploy, and who's going to defend it, and so on. There are still lots of questions. Now, despite these divisions, I think there are some potential areas for cooperation, or maybe a convergence of interests, let's put it that way. One area, I think, is over the scope of the train and equip program. So if you look at the legislation from the U.S. side, the appropriation and the number of soldiers trained are fixed. But it allows, the legislation allows for regional allies to supplement those funds and to train additional forces. So it doesn't, money, let's say, put forward by Turkey or Arab Gulf countries or so on, this would not replace American funding, but it would supplement it. So that's a possible area of cooperation going forward. Still the dispute over what the force's end goal is, but it's a possible area of cooperation. Another area of cooperation concerns border security. There's a lot of tension between Washington and Ankara, I think, over who's crossing over the border into Syria, specifically concerning the idea of jihadists. But the problem is for as much Washington complains about this, they don't have the means to really track these individuals or to apprehend them. And that's where discussions with Turkey, with its long border with Syria, come in.
2 minutes.
The other area is possible diplomacy with Russia over a transition in Syria. That's a new development. I just came from Moscow. I can tell you that there is some convergence between Moscow and the United States over the concern about how much the Syrian conflict generates terrorism. Also over the number of foreign fighters, particularly from the Russian side, that are going from beyond the Caucasus, but even central Russia, down to Syria to train. But also the Russians are very disappointed with the Assad regime because the last talks in Moscow went terribly, and the Assad regime did not listen to Putin's advisors on this, and so there's a lot of question marks. And we'll have to see what role Turkey plays in that. The Russians told me when I was there that they actually had a good dialogue with Turkey. But last but not least, I think perhaps the cooperation that beyond the diplomacy, beyond the border security, would go into and be sort of almost necessary, because with this corpse of a country, different regional, Syria's neighbors have developed spheres of influence inside of Syria with different opposition groups. And I think this is going to be the new normal until we get on a glide path towards putting the pieces of Syria back together again. And I think there, the United States has to speak with Turkey about about what to do, about common objectives across the border, with an eye towards what we want Syria, what we both want Syria to be going forward, whether we want it to be one country, do we want it to be one country only in theory, but with a great degree of decentralization. And I think that's going to be a major challenge going forward. That's all. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Cordesman, how do you see Turks and Americans in the Middle East?
Let me be very careful, because I'm not going to answer that question. What I was asked to talk about is the U.S. role in the Middle East. And I think it's very important that people think about it in those terms. First, the Middle East in general is one of three areas of strategic concentration. The other is obviously dealing with the Ukraine and a new set of problems in Europe. Our primary strategic challenge in terms of simply volume and size, importance, is the emergence of China as a much more serious problem than people anticipated even 2 years ago in the problems in the South China Sea. When we talk about this region, Syria is one conflict out of 4, all of which involve failed states. People forget that before the political problems in Syria, quite correctly, groups like the Arab Development Report pointed out that Syria in many ways had failed to make the economic transitions and progress to compete, to act as a state that was really developing relative to the other countries in the region. But Iraq, for a very different set of reasons, some of them stemming from the US invasion, but many of them going much further back, is also a state deeply divided without effective governance, without an effective economy, where the problems between ethnic and sectarian groups are as serious as the problems of Islamic extremism. We face in Yemen probably the most failed state in the region and one of the most failed states in the world in terms of economics, governance, security structures. And for all the focus I sometimes hear about the Houthi in Iran, this was a state that had managed to fail perhaps in many ways decades earlier. If you look at its economic and governance history, it has had essentially a small elite in the form of the Saleh group dancing on the head of snakes, to quote the leader. When he left, the deep divisions in Yemen essentially became exposed. And then, because we can't forget, we are also fighting in Afghanistan. We deal with an American political structure where people sometimes call for more dramatic military intervention, but it is far from clear that any of those calls will lead to action, money, or the commitment of troops to combat. So one has to distinguish between policy and reality. And we are already involved in a deeply divisive presidential campaign which is focused on domestic issues. So when you look at American relations with Turkey or the American role in Syria, understand where this really lies. Our strategic concentration is not the Levant and it is not the Eastern Mediterranean. Politically, we are tied to Israel. And we have links to Egypt and we have links to Jordan. But I have to say, as I often have to say, the Lebanese understand where our priorities lie. And they lie fundamentally in the Gulf. We are not, at this point, able to determine how serious the level of confrontation we are going to have with Iran will be. But if there is anything that's been fairly clear in the last month, it is that the nuclear issue, even if we get an agreement and it works, is not going to resolve the other security problems with Iran. And the stable flow of global energy exports out of the Gulf matters strategically to the United States. And Syria is a humanitarian interest. We have, in reality, talked, and Andrew mentioned this, about 5,000 supposed moderate rebels we're going to train. The last I saw, we had recruited under 500 to go into the training cycle. The only rebel movement we'd ever seriously backed was decisively defeated in late 2014 and this spring, and essentially driven out of Syria. I don't know of any meaningful moderate element in the resistance in Syria today. We have no more reason to like them than we do Assad. And as Andrew pointed out, we are dealing with a country where the question gets to be, with something on the order of 7.5 million people displaced within the country, 3.7 million as refugees, and the CIA estimating the population at 18 million. How the hell do you put this thing back together? And it is not a matter of finding military intervention, nor is it having a buffer zone, which I have never heard anybody define in a way that makes any military or political sense. And that is an issue between us and Turkey.
2 minutes.
Our key concentration in this region is Iraq. Unless we are willing to step up air power and provide a great deal more military advisory effort forward than we have to date, it isn't working. That's obvious. You can see it. But the basic problem is Iraq isn't working. There's been no progress, even under a much better prime minister, in bringing Sunni, Shiite, and Kurd together. Yemen is an area where basically we no longer have a military presence. We can intervene, we can support, and we are supporting the Saudis. We can build up our Arab allies in the Gulf. And for all the tension sometimes, there is a massive U.S. military train and assist effort there, and this is an area where we have steadily built up our naval and air forces. But these are the issues we really have to face. And one thing, let me just conclude with. Sometimes I have the feeling that people in the region, whether they are Turks, Jordanians, Lebanese, or anywhere else, have the feeling that if the U.S. only wanted to, it could wave a magic wand and fix this region. Again, I'd go back to the Arab Development Report. Long before 2011 and any of these crises began, it estimated it would take at least a decade of effective governance to deal with the demographic, economic, and other issues that would be a crisis even if we did not have Islamic movements. We have no magic wand, and we have limited strategic interests as a global power. That is often hard for people in this region or Asia or Europe to face. But one way or another, that will be the reality. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Cordesman. I'm going to skip Shadi for now, and I'll come to you, Burhanettin Duran. Some strong and provocative stuff we've heard so far. What does it sound like in your Turkish ear?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will start with the general framework of the Middle East seen by Turkish perspective, and later we'll come to some issues to be discussed. After the Arab Spring issues until now, we can say that there is a battle over the post-Arab Spring regional order in the Middle East now. Actually, I mean, Sykes-Picot agreement is no longer valid, and there is a competition among regional powers and some sub-state actors in the formation of this new regional order. And this order is not established yet, but it's full of chaos and competitions. Mr. Cordesman spoke about failed states, and I would add that competition of rival powers, regional powers, like Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Turkey. This is the first factor to be discussed. And the second one is rise of theopolitics and sectarianism coming out of this competition. And the third one is the burgeoning of sub-state actors and radical Islamist organizations, some terrorist organizations in this chaos. Well, actually, this disorder is somehow related to power vacuum left by the United States. You know, we know that in the Bush administration, there was a different policy, different US involvement in the region. But under Obama administration, we can see a selective low-level involvement in some significant issues in the region. Not trying to solve the issues by US involvement, but somehow facilitating local actors and regional actors to solve their matters. This creates a chaos that regional powers can compete with each others. And they mobilize somehow to actualize their national interests. They mobilize some religious discourses, and at the same time, they use hard power and soft power instruments at the same time. I mean, somehow militias, some aiding some groups to make propaganda for their conceptualization of Islam as competing understandings of Islam. But of course, I am not saying that this is about sectarianism. Sectarianism is just a result of this competition of powers among the regional states. So this is becoming more and more fertile ground for non-state actors and radical Islamist groups, be like it in Syria, in Yemen, in Iraq, for the time being. And from these three factors, I can speculate somehow the future of Islamic movements. You know, well, this future is not bright. Mr. Cordesman mentioned the magic formula. There is no magic formula, of course. You know, all these powers are competing with each other. And then this is also a sign of US reluctance in managing all these affairs actively for the region. What is problematic here is the future of moderate Islamic movement. After the fall of Ikhwan, Muslim Brotherhood, there is no bright prospect for democratic transformation of Islamism, which we need so much for the future peace of the stability and the peace of the region. So there should be something for both regional powers and the US to do something with engagement with, rethinking engagement with moderate actors. In other case, there will be no moderates to talk with them. What about Turkey's position here? You know, this new conflicts and competition has come at odds with regional perspective of Turkey more than others. You know, just before the Arab Spring, Turkey was following a zero-problem policy with neighbors, economic cooperation, and like Kemal Kılıçdaroğlu's terms, trading state capacities and priorities. But after the Arab Spring, Turkey tried to somehow initiate democratic transformations in the relevant countries, I mean Egypt, Tunisia, and others. But after the Syrian civil war and the coup d'etat in Egypt, Turkey's major perspective, major regional perspective was narrowed because of these developments. Turkey was expecting to balance somehow Saudi Arabia and Iranian expansionism and their polarization, their competition, in establishing an axis of Egypt and Turkey. But after the fall of Morsi, and this prospect was no longer valid. So, what is the new perspective for Turkey? Turkey is, sorry?
2 minutes.
Yeah, Turkey is trying to balance Iran and Saudi Arabia in their transnational politics, mobilizing their religious discourses and militias. And of course, it is easier said than done. And Turkey faces some challenges coming from radical Islamist groups at the same time. And Turkey's synthesis with a multi-dimensional, multi-layered civilization discourse is trying to combine secularism and democracy at the same time. And this should pave for the way for the integration of Islamic movements, maybe similar to Turkey's experience. Of course, I accept that Turkey's experience is different from others, but at the same time, there should be a prospect for this. Otherwise, there would be no moderates to talk with, to be engaged with, and this chaos from the Middle East, at the end, sooner or later, will spread to outside, and US and other powers could not continue with letting them their problems and conflicts in the Middle East as implosion. It will explode at any time, sooner or later.
Burhanettin, Duran, thank you. Shadi, how do you see it?
Thank you. Thanks to SETA for having me. I'm going to focus on Turkey as a model of Islamism in the region, and I guess I'll put model in quotation marks. I'm going to get a little bit metaphysical, so just bear with me. Let me start with an anecdote. I met Mohammed Morsi for the first time in May 2010, and it was a few months before the Arab Spring, obviously, so it was a very different time. I described the Muslim Brotherhood to him as an opposition group, but he objected to the word opposition. This is what he told me, quote unquote. The word opposition has the connotation of seeking power, but at this moment, we are not seeking power because that requires preparation and society is not prepared. Now, this is interesting in retrospect, and obviously I had no idea and he had no idea that he'd become the first elected president of Egypt, but it's interesting because it gets at the state of mind of mainstream Islamists, at least in the pre-Arab Spring period. This idea of being cautious and careful and not moving too quickly, too soon, playing the long game. But I think more importantly, the realization that they had to work within existing state structures. So in this sense, the state as such, the modern nation state as such, was not a problem. The problem was who ruled the state. Now, this state centrism, which is what I would call it, is a bit of a problem, and I'll get to that in a moment. I don't want to just, I should say that I'm going to use the word Islamist. I know that the AK Party is described sometimes as Islamically oriented, neo-Islamist, post-Islamist, but for definitional simplicity, I'll just say Islamist. Now, and they also derive from originally mainstream political Islam as founded by the Muslim Brotherhood, at least originally. So what we see with the AK Party, similar to what Morsi described, again, is this idea of moving gradually. So when they came to power in 2002, they downplayed their Islamism, they focused on the economy, they got things done. When they would talk about something as controversial as the headscarf issue, Erdogan would say things like, it's important, we're angry about it, but it's not the right time now. And this is a striking thing because there have been restrictions on the headscarf up until quite recently, 2013. So this is something that took a very long time to resolve. So that's very gradual. And especially considering that it was a major demand of the AK Party's base. I mean, what's more personal than being denied the right to wear a piece of clothing? But this idea of gradualism only tells us so much. Politics isn't just about how you get there, it's about what you do and what you want to do after you get there. And this is where I think the AK Party model is very, very interesting, and where Turkey becomes a model, but not necessarily in a great way. So let me explain. From the founding of the Turkish state, the state has been the center of Turkish political life. And the state was in some ways an end unto itself, but not only that, it was a means to a greater end. That the state was so powerful and so dominant and so centralized that it could be used to re-engineer and reimagine Turkish society. And that was under the Kemalists, and that happened for a very long time. And what's interesting about the AK Party's discourse is that they use a very similar kind of state-centric discourse. And we hear Erdogan talking about the objective being the nurturing of pious Turkish citizens. And they don't become pious by themselves, they need the help of the state. And this is where I would describe it as a kind of soft Islamization. The AK Party isn't forcing anyone to be anything, but they are creating incentives for religiosity. And these incentives depend on state power, or they encourage the dependence of Turkish citizens on the state. So we can talk about the various examples, you know, stipends for people who get married early, have 3 or more kids, expansion of Imam Hatip schools, Islamization of the educational curricula to some extent. Under the AK Party, there's also been a significant increase of the Diyanet's budget. And the Diyanet was a problem under Kemalist rule, but they're not trying to change that very problematic situation. I mean, secularism in a secular system in the truest sense of the word, or at least the truest sense of the word in the American sense, you should not have the state controlling local religious institutions. But over time, the AK Party presides over the expansion of this state religious bureaucracy. Now, I think it's fair to criticize the AK Party for its authoritarianism. I think it makes less sense to criticize the AK Party for its Islamism. Democracy is about reflecting popular sentiment. So is it really fair to expect Islamists to stop being what they actually are? If they became liberals, they wouldn't be Islamist anymore. They're Islamists for a reason. So just as secularists should be able to promote secularism if they are elected, Islamists should be able to promote Islamism if they are elected. But so the AK Party has a right to do these things, right? But that doesn't mean it's not a problem. And this is where I'll just kind of start to close up. You know, let me just go back a couple centuries. I mean, in the pre-modern...
In 2 minutes, two centuries.
Yeah, I will. I'll cover the 2 centuries very quickly. So in the pre-modern era, Islam was a source of unity and consensus because there wasn't something called secularism. The idea of Islamic law was uncontested. But in the modern era, Islam, at least as far as Islamists are concerned, has to be self-consciously asserted because it's being asserted against the rise of secularism, westernization, and so on. So what ends up happening is that Islam or Islamic identity becomes the province of one party. And then political parties, they compete over state power. And because the Turkish state is so strong and overdeveloped, it makes the state such a prize, and it raises the stakes of the political game. Politics becomes existential. And this is why you have a fundamental problem when you fuse Islam, the modern nation state, and political parties together. And I think we see examples of that. So this process of Islamists operationalizing their Islam through political parties in their quest for state power, it becomes inherently destabilizing. However, so the state-centric model is problematic, as I've laid out, and it has to be rethought, and Islamists have to rethink it. But we reach a little bit of an impasse because as problematic as the state-centric model is, the alternatives are probably worse.
Great, Shadi, thank you very much. And I want to do a quick round of questions and answers before I go to the audience. One question that I want to start with is a question that many people in the Arab world ask. The fascination with Turkey in the Arab world has historically been that Turkey, not just geographically, but also culturally and politically, sits between Europe and the Middle East. Andrew Tabler, my question is rooted in the past, but I want you to root the answer in the future. Erdogan had Europe stable, democratic, prosperous, and in 2011, he decided to take the ship in a different direction. Was that a mistake? Did he have the luxury not to take the ship in that different direction?
Was it a mistake? No, I think that the problem is that Turkey borders immediately these two broken states in Syria and Iraq, and all the fundamental problems that come out of them. I mean, getting back to our earlier discussion and Dr. Cordesman's, remarks, Syria was a basket case. The regime was a basket case long, previously. It was, and I've written extensively about that. The state didn't function, and unfortunately, we had a very rigid political system. It didn't function. It was hugely brutal, and it continues to be in its own population, and doesn't change. And then you have some of the highest population growth rates in the world, going back, particularly after the Hama massacre of 1982. So it's hard to balance that out. So I think Prime Minister Erdogan probably looked at the future, and like all leaders, they have to gamble. The problem, I think, is that in the case of Syria, not to be cliche, but there really are no easy answers. I think there are compartmentalized answers in certain parts of the country that involve the neighbors of Syria, and by extension, perhaps the neighbors of Iraq. But as an overall solution, we just don't see that yet. And I think Turkey's invested in it. It had no choice but to do this. But to be fair, one thing I will say, Turkey, I started going to Turkey in 2000, and at that time, Turkey was very oriented towards Europe. Over time, as it developed its policy of turning to the Middle East and the zero problems with neighbors, that deepened their economic, in particular, but also political engagement. I think now Turkey is on the side of the majority in the Middle East. The majority doesn't necessarily win. And it goes in fits and starts, and I think Turkey's in for a very long ride, unfortunately, like the rest of us.
Burhanettin, if I may come to you, I mean, given the internal dynamics in Turkey, which Shadi talked about, the fact that they have, back then, before 2011, they had this Islamist leading government. Once things began to happen in the Arab world, could they not have directed their policy towards the Middle East the way they did? Could they have stuck with Europe even when the Middle East looked in democratic turmoil, so to speak, back in 2011, do you think?
Well, as I mentioned in my talk, Turkey's foreign policy from just the beginning was based, AK Parti's foreign policy vision was based on a multi-level, multi-layered understanding of civilization. It means that you can combine both European and Western orientation with the Middle Eastern one at the same time. But what Arab Spring came out, it brought some opportunities for Turkey to open the borders, intellectually and physically, to Middle Eastern people. So that's why Turkey was so much preoccupied with the Middle Eastern affairs. But coming to the discussion on the Islamism issue for AK Party, I should add something, some remarks to Shadi's comments. Well, AK Party is not accepting to be termed as Islamist. Maybe that's why I can name it as Islamically sensitive party. But what about the policies? AK Party is severely criticized by opposition as becoming more neo-Ottomanist, Islamist, sometimes so much pro-American at the same time. These are the internal critics. But what about the actuality? The Turkish Islamic movement in the past was just directed to meet religious education and headscarf issue, not more than that. For example, we cannot see any Islamist movement who called for the application of Sharia. So what is happening under AK Party government now is not Islamization or soft Islamization, is the meeting of the demands of people in the public. But of course, I accept that there is a great challenge coming from the post-Arab Spring chaos in terms of radical Islamic groups for Turkey even. So that's why Turkish government and Diyanet have to do something to teach people, somehow to give people religious education in different means to face this reality. But that doesn't mean that Turkey is becoming more Islamist. Given Turkey's socioeconomic, secular strength, background, this is not possible even. So we should understand this in that way.
Okay. I want to bring this discussion into the geopolitical sphere with Anthony Cordesman. Dr. Cordesman, Shadi, when he was recounting his story with Morsi, Morsi told him that, you know, you need to be prepared for power. And obviously, it sounds to me that the Turks were not prepared for what was going to happen in the region in 2011. The Turks are very strong allies of the United States. They are a member of NATO. If the Turks make a mistake, logic tells me that the United States, by definition, has also made a mistake. How do you see it?
Well, if the United States is always seen as the blame of the last resort, it follows in a very Middle Eastern model, which you, I think, are impugning or giving to Turkey, which is the Middle East has three major exports: petroleum, blame, and responsibility. Two of them have never been particularly useful to the Middle East. The fact is that no one predicts the point at which the structural issues that divide and undermine the state explode into instability and revolution. But if you go back to the Arab Development Report of 2003 and you look at what followed for a decade, those pressures were steadily building up. The warning signals were given again and again. They were deep and far beyond the control of outside powers. Whereas Andrew pointed out, you can influence part of the situation some of the time, but you can't take a nation where the demographics are the population is 5 times or more what it was in 1950. You can't have a situation where more than 50% of the population is under 24, and you have 30 to 40% of youth either unemployed or underemployed, and to have somebody on the outside deal with this. Now, you mentioned Morsi. It doesn't matter whether it's this region. You can go back to the Russian Revolution or the French Revolution. Well-meaning members of the educated middle class do a dismal job of surviving revolutions and governing almost regardless of culture. The whole idea that you somehow have this class waiting to govern doesn't really work. And there was no one in Turkey or the United States or anywhere else on the outside that could suddenly provide that, any more than throwing a group of Shiite exiles into power in Iraq could somehow fix the lack of any alternative political structure there. So all I can say is if you are waiting for the United States to come over the horizon and save anybody in this region, don't hold your breath.
Okay. Shadi, Dr. Cordesman talked about the blame as a product, in blaming the others as a product in the region. Just to balance the sheets on that product as he sees it. The United States invested a lot of effort in promoting Turkey to the rest of the Muslim world as a model of a tolerant Islamist political system. Now we've seen the limits of Islamist movements in the region since 2011, especially after the toppling of Morsi. Where does that leave Turkey, And where does that leave Turkey as an ally of the United States, a model that the Americans had hoped would prosper in the region to counter intolerance and extremism, even under George Bush?
So, well, first of all, on this issue of blame, and I agree with Dr. Cordesman, and I've been somewhat impressed with, maybe Turks have a similar thing, but Egyptians come up with the most creative conspiracy theories, and it's gotten to the point where I can't even follow the intricacies of the conspiracy. I don't really get what's going on here. That said, the reason that there is so much blame of the US, it's not all imaginary. There are very good reasons to be angry at the US because our policy has been absolutely disastrous for the last 6 years. And Syria, I think, is the prime example of this. And actually, when it comes to safe zones and buffer zones, there have been people, and Andrew is one of them, who have laid out viable plans for how this would work. So anyone who says that there isn't an alternative, they might not like the alternative that we propose, but that doesn't mean the alternative doesn't exist. But what we can do is judge America's decision to not intervene in Syria. At the very least, and we can judge it now, 3 years later, and say it's an utter, absolute failure. There are actually, I wrote a piece recently where I actually proposed a moratorium on the word moderate. I think we should get away from that, and the idea that rebels have to be moderate is a bizarre idea. If you're fighting and dying for a cause, why in the world would you care about being moderate? But anyway, to kind of go a little bit on the issue of whether Turkey can still be, some kind of model in all this. Turkey deserves a lot of criticism. I'm very concerned about Erdogan's authoritarian bent. That said, if we look at it from a regional perspective, Turkey is still today, relatively speaking, more democratic than almost every single other country in the Arab world, with the possible exception of Tunisia. So let's also be fair here, and I feel like Turkey gets attacked for being authoritarian more than Sisi does, which is absurd to me. So, look, at the very least, there has to be some way to incorporate Islam in democratic politics. If we can't do that, if we fail in doing that, then groups like ISIS, their narrative is going to be strengthened immeasurably because that's precisely their message. Forget about the state. Forget about the democratic process. We have to supersede the state. So we have to find a way to include and incorporate mainstream Islamism in the existing state structure. We have to find a way.
Okay, thank you very much. As you can all see, there are mics on either side of the room. If you have any comments or questions, please make your way to the microphone. Identify yourself. Please, please, please don't give lectures, quick comments or quick questions, and ask for the person you're addressing that comment or question to by name. Thank you. Go ahead, please.
Thank you. I am Mahir Zenolov from today's Saman Daily. I have a question for Shadi Hamid. Shadi, you talked about how the Turkish ruling party gradually made progress on many social and political issues. And we also know that the Turkish ruling party was so enthusiastic about pushing Egypt's Muslim Brotherhood to defy the Egyptian military and hostile judiciary. Do you think that was not a smart move on the part of Ankara? Thank you.
Okay. So, well, we know now that it wasn't a smart move. Now, there can be some debate about what was Erdogan and other AK Party leaders actually, what were they telling Morsi in that very critical phase? And Turkey and Qatar both had leverage with the Morsi government. As far as I can tell, Turkey and Qatar did not put as much pressure as they should have put on Morsi. And they should have encouraged him to kind of bite the bullet and to make very difficult compromises, regardless of the democratic mandate that the Brotherhood claimed. And I think in retrospect, that turned out to be a mistake. And I don't know, I can speculate, but perhaps one part of the problem was that the AK Party is very majoritarian in how it understands democracy, and so is the Brotherhood. So when the Brotherhood was acting in this very majoritarian manner, I doubt that Erdogan thought to himself, this is a real problem. They have to be more liberal, inclusive, reach out to the opposition, because that's not something that at the time the AK Party was very good at.
Okay.
there was
Oh,
before me.
excuse me. I'll come over to you, yes. We can hear you.
Okay. So my question relates back to some extent to the previous panel also. But one of the questions, one of the problems, you all discussed the problems in the Middle East. A major problem in the Middle East is there are no jobs. There's a population, I think Tony alluded to it, or somebody alluded to the fact that there are millions of young men, probably young women also, who have no hope, who have no jobs, who don't see any future. So to have any type of a peace, any type of how should we call it, hope, you have to employ these people. How do you see the future of manufacturing? Not much. Any type of institutions that really fit into the global economic picture? That seems to be missing. Does anybody see any hope for that in this region?
Okay, and before we go to an answer, can I ask you two quick favors? One, identify yourself and then tell me who exactly you're addressing that question to.
Mike Kurtzig, who worked on the Middle East for the Department of Agriculture, particularly on Turkey and Iran. Maybe Tony would like to answer that, or
Okay,
somebody.
and then I'll ask the respondent, since this is not directly related to Turkey, to be very brief in their answer. Thank you.
I think the answers are that if you look at, for some of the countries, the plans that the World Bank, the IMF, USAID, and others have presented, you have a reasonable chance of, if you can get rid of the major barriers that governments now create to effective development and internal economic activity, you can create more jobs. It won't be quick. It won't bring sudden stability. The most optimistic plans tend to be 5 to 10-year plans before you have a major effect. There are some cases in the region. Yemen is one of them, but it's going to be very interesting to see what happens in Syria with more than half the population now totally displaced from their former home or job, which present such serious challenges, it isn't clear how it works. But it is not something where these population problems create some kind of Malthusian nightmare for the region. The real problem is that there is nearly a 50-year history of failing to reform at the level that people in the region, as economists and experts, have called for.
Thank you. Please.
Chris Phillips, I'm from Chatham House in London. My question is specifically towards Andrew, but I think any of the panelists could raise it. And it's about the extent to which the Kurdish dimension in Syria is now an obstacle towards US and Turkish cooperation. There has been a huge amount of briefing by the Turkish government against including the PYD in the Syrian opposition groupings ever since the beginning of the Syrian revolution. And now you have the United States actively supporting PYD militia, the YPG, in northern Syria against ISIS. And I was just wondering whether or not, is this something that is being dealt with in terms of, is it being managed between sort of Ankara and Washington, or is it actually something that you foresee as being a quite major stumbling block in the future? Thank you.
I would say it is a very delicate issue. And Chris, you raise a good point, because Turkey has an ongoing dialogue and process with its Kurdish population as well as in Iraq, but Turkey prefers to deal with a certain group of Kurds, right? And so in Syria we have the PYD, the local variant of the PKK, and they are not the Kurds that Ankara would like to deal with or like to see in power in Syria. Now, why is this relevant now? Getting to your question, it's because Syria's neighbors are carving up spheres of influence inside of Syria, right? So suddenly you have to look at, okay, so who is behind the PYD and how do you merge it? And then the PYD has very different relationships with Turkey, with Iran, and so on. And so this becomes a real source of friction because the United States recently has loosened up its outreach to the PYD. And the different, the YPG and so on. I think because there was a discussion that they wanted to know more about them, and keeping them at arm's length didn't really serve U.S. purposes. Now, Politically, though, going forward, I think you kind of have to have some sort of agreement between the U.S. And Turkey on these Kurdish areas, particularly because ISIS is attacking them quite substantially, which is leading to U.S. intervention. And with U.S. intervention and airstrikes come special forces teams and other forces there. And I think ultimately there will have to be more comprehensive discussions over this. What it is leading to exactly, I'm not sure, Chris, at the moment. But I think it's going to be a source of friction going forward, and it's not something that's easily solved.
Burhanettin, how do you see it, this Kurdish issue, in the context of the dynamics between Ankara and Washington, but also the dynamics in a place like Iraq and what the U.S. wants and can achieve or not achieve in Iraq?
Well, the Kurdish issue is not something national in Turkey's perspective. You know, the KRG and PYD are the Kurdish actors in both failing Syria and Iraq. But at the same time, Turkey has its own Kurdish process, resolution process. So through this process and the realities that happen in Kobani and Iraq, PKK is trying to empower itself by referring to these regional Kurdish issues and the relations with the actors. So Turkey is facing a challenge to continue both with the resolution process and at the same time to deal with the security issues coming out from these autonomous regions. And at the same time to develop more economic cooperation with the KRG. And that doesn't mean the recognition of independence of KRG at the same time. So from that perspective, with the US relations, the basic problem was on the Maliki administration. You know, Maliki administration was following a sectarian Shia policy, and US did not caring about this until the Abadi's government. And now I think there is a space for Turkey and US to develop somehow coherent policy towards Kurdish actors, but with accepting that this is partly related to Turkey's own Kurdish problem.
Thank you. Sir, please.
Alan Makovsky, Center for American Progress. Thanks for the interesting presentations. My two quick questions for Andrew. You mentioned that the U.S. now, although it may want to see Assad go, it doesn't want to see him go now. One of the suggestions in terms of a humanitarian response to what's going on in Syria is that the U.S. should use its assets, which are in the region anyway, its air assets, to bomb the runways. I've been told there's 17 key runways. I'm sure you know if there is a number that could be put on it, you would know better. I'm just curious, were the U.S. to pursue that policy, would it affect Assad's ability to stay in power? I mean, is one inhibitor the U.S. in bombing the runways, which would prevent the barrel bombing, and that is it that it would, in fact, hasten Assad's fall prematurely, let's say? Actually, I'd welcome Tony's thoughts on that, too. Maybe with a codicil, alternatively, is it a slippery slope in terms of U.S. involvement? Would we be able to limit our involvement to just bombing runways if that were our choice? Secondly, on the train and equip negotiations, one of the impediments along the way, which delayed the agreement between the U.S. and Turkey, of course, was who these trained forces would train their guns on initially. Would it be on ISIS or would it be on the Assad regime? With Turkey, of course, insisting it should be the Assad regime, the U.S. saying ISIS. Has this question, now that the program's underway, been fully resolved?
Thank you. How about, if you'll bear with me, we'll start with Tony and then swing back to you.
let me say that every time I've heard people who have no actual experience in doing a target downlay talk about the use of air power, it reminds me of the fact that you really wouldn't hire a surgeon to be a plumber. And quite frankly, no, bombing runways doesn't work that way. If you take the aircraft out, it could have an impact. The barrel bombs are often delivered by helicopters, where bombing the runway, for obvious reason, really doesn't do a hell of a lot. But the more serious issue is, at this point, you have sufficient pressure from various rebel groups on the Assad regime that I don't think that the issue is any more a matter of the US having some magic leverage. The Assad regime will either recover from what's happening now or it won't. The other thing, about this training of the moderate rebels, enough has leaked into the press to understand what's really happening. We aren't to any meaningful role. There simply aren't enough people to train in numbers that matter that are going into the system. And part of it is that you're training them in the rear. You don't have people forward to assist, and you probably wouldn't with the rebels that are there. But that is not going to deliver 5,000 people by the end of this year. We will be damn lucky to have 2,200, and most of them aren't people I would send forward.
Andrew?
Yeah, I would agree. I think bombing 17 runways is not going to take care of the problem. It wouldn't take care of the that would take care of the ability to launch fixed-wing aircraft. And I'm not an expert on this at all. Yeah, most of the barrel bombs are delivered via helicopter, so you'd have to. How would you deal with that? I think it perhaps would, depending on what the base is, there are the core Assad regime-controlled areas, and then there's the periphery, and it might affect their ability to hold on to some areas, maybe. But unfortunately, there isn't a clean answer there, and that's very problematic. I think not just because of the barrel bombs, but because of the gas issue. And I think is very interesting developments going on at the Security Council and with the OPCW concerning Syria's declarations or lack thereof of its stockpile, but as well as the continued use of chlorine, which was not included in the original agreement. So that file, which many people, including President Obama, thought was closed, is not closed, right? And that's a huge. Tony mentioned earlier about the humanitarian interest, right? It's hard for all of that to go on indefinitely, right? And just let it happen then, and to say that we have a victory on chemical weapons in Syria. Yes, the strategic stockpile is largely destroyed or out of the country, but the problem still remains, and it remains as a huge political problem. So that's that's an open wound, so to speak. The second part of the question was what? Sorry. Concerning training rebels. Yeah, I mean, so there is a program. It exists. We know what the parameters are. The problem is that it is not being. It is low on the list of priorities. It is, I think, there as a placeholder, as a backup strategy to whatever kind of other solution someone can pull out of their hat. On this. And the latest one is the engagement with the Russians. Okay, so you can try that. But the problem is that I still don't understand, after all of these discussions, whether it's on Syria or Iraq and so on, I still don't understand the land force that goes in and defeats ISIS and Jabhat al-Nusra in Syria and Iraq. I don't get it. I mean, unless the neighbors are going to do that, I don't understand what force it is. And I agree with Dr. Cordesman. Moderates are really hard to find these days in an organized fashion. There are plenty of moderates, but they're politically disillusioned. Many of them are offshore and are not willing to work with the United States in any comprehensive way because they don't trust it. Maybe that would, I don't think that's going to be solved, certainly as long as President Obama's in office. Whether that will change with a new president, I don't know.
Can I just add something? Very quickly? Yes. Yeah, this issue of 17 runways, well, first of all, I don't know anyone who's proposed just doing that, so I think it's a little bit of a straw man. And even in August 2013, when the Obama administration was very close to intervening militarily, the limited pinprick strike that Kerry was talking about would have still been significantly more extensive than taking out 17 runways. And when it comes to military experience and who's actually offering the advice, there were many, if not most, of the military brass who were on board with the almost intervention of August 2013. And any of us who have talked to people in the military, there are some who support military intervention or did in Syria and some who don't. So I think this idea that there's a correlation between military experience and opposing military intervention in Syria is just simply not factually correct. Lastly, on the issue of moderate, between the so-called moderates, who secular, liberal, fluffy, whatever you want to call them on one end, and Jabhat al-Nusra and ISIS on the other, there are many mainstream Islamist factions, and we have to have a policy. Doesn't mean we have to support them, but we have to at least be open to engaging with them. So there's this vast space in between that when we talk about moderates, fine, Islamists aren't necessarily moderate, but they are in between. And if anything, in the Syrian context, they are relatively speaking moderate compared to who's on their right flank. And Ambassador Ford had started to try to reach out to some of these mainstream Islamist factions, but never gained traction. But we have to rethink that.
And then I'll come to you, and then I'll come to you.
Let me be really blunt. I've actually been involved in their campaign planning in several different wars. And the kind of things I see come out of think tanks, and particularly out of retired military who have never done it, done any targeting, done any damage assessment, used intelligence, or actually had to schedule airstrikes, what we get is a lot of well-meaning rubbish. It doesn't mean that you don't have the capability to do these things. And you don't necessarily need a vast number of strikes to suppress an air force. A lot depends on what that air force does. But I would have to say in this Washington think tank and media community, you either know what you're doing or you don't. And wearing a uniform doesn't mean you know what you're doing, because an admiral is not a pilot unless they're in naval aviation. So I get a little tired of the idea that because you can put together a rational concept that sounds halfway convincing, if you haven't ever done it, you somehow have a workable plan.
Okay, bear with me 1 second, since there's a panelist that I need to get in on this before I come to you. On the issue of Assad that the gentleman over there asked about. Now, you could argue that Assad has many different belts built around him in the region. One is you have Sisi, a staunchly anti-Islamist regime in Cairo, a powerful capital. The other belt or belts are built around him by Iran for all sorts of different reasons. Where does that leave Turkey? Obviously, Erdogan wants him gone, but where do these two capitals leave Erdogan's plan to have Bashar gone?
Well, Syrian civil war was a complicated issue from the beginning. All but everybody knew that it would not be an easy job to deal with this crisis because of Iranian involvement for the axis of resistance, and again Assad's allies as Russia or others. But what was problematic here is that all people knew that there would be more conflict, more radicalization, and more humanitarian issues coming out of this issue. But nobody proposed any workable solution for this crisis. And Turkey is, in favor of safety zone and no-fly zone and the fall of Assad. But this is very critical for both the regional alliances and Iranian support to Syria, and now Sisi's support to Syria. Turkey wants to train and equip Syrian moderates there can, or let's say mainstream groups, and at any time for this support, there can be some other opportunities to solve this problem. We don't get this problem into the chaos of fighting sides.
Okay, just a quick update on the time to the end of this session, exactly 10 minutes. Please, go.
My name is Ilhan Kagri. I'm from the Muslim Public Affairs Council. One of the things that the Muslim Public Affairs Council deals with is how to counter the attraction that the violent extremist philosophy that we see in Islam has towards Americans and American Muslims and other Muslims throughout the world. The Pew Research organization had a study that showed that the more people know about Islam, or Muslims know about their religion, and the more they practice their religion, the less radical their views are towards Islam. I find that, so in the United States, we know that, and the West, that's true, that the more that people practice Islam, the more they know, the less radical their views are going to be. However, in Turkey, what we find is that there's a more traditional understanding of Islam, whereas in the West, we have this enlightened and much more intellectual view towards Islam. In Turkey, I find when you go to regular schools, especially these Imam Hatip schools, it's a very, very traditional form of Islam, and it's just kind of taught downwards, and it's not opened up for critical thinking. So isn't there a fear that as you encourage more and more younger people to enter into these religious schools, that you're actually opening them up to becoming more attracted to the kinds of views that are being, proposed by ISIS and with their wonderful campaigns and things like that?
That's a Shadi kind of answer.
Actually, it was for Mr. Duran. It was
Okay,
for Mr.
all
Duran.
right.
Both of them.
Okay.
Well, the problem with religious education in public schools is something to be discussed so much, because I share your concerns that if you provide so much religious education to young people, and they may be driven to some radical groups as jihadi Salafis or others. But I can ask the same question in reverse. If you don't provide young people, religious education, how can they provide their meaning for their lives? So they need somehow religious knowledge. And that's why Turkey's public schools are providing religious information. This is not just peculiar to AK Party period. It was like in the previous Kemalist regime. But real problem is here, what kind of religious education you can provide people. Of course, it should be more open to cosmopolitan world, open to interaction, and it should be inclusive. And this is the issue in Turkey people are now talking. And when it comes to Imam Hatip schools, there can be some traditional religiously oriented people, but at the same time, like Kartal Imam Hatip School, there are some young people who are more open to world and interaction, and we should not take this as just traditional religious schools. There are different perceptions of Islam's, and what is critical here, there should be a free environment for the competition of these different religious understandings. That is that should be the role of the state.
Yeah, just a quick note. I mean, so I think we have to be careful about seeing religious education as a solution to the problem of extremism. Because if I'm thinking about when I meet with brotherhood activists or leaders on one hand and jihadi Salafis on the other, I would actually argue that jihadi Salafis tend to be more theologically sophisticated in terms of being aware of actual texts and arguments in the tradition. The Muslim Brotherhood derives from the Islamic modernist movement of the late 19th, early 20th century, which is not very it's not very textually focused. Now, that's fine. That's actually better, I would argue. But I think we have to be careful about assuming. And if we look at the ISIS leadership, I would say that they're actually, they're quite well versed in some aspects of the Islamic tradition. Obviously, they pick and choose, and they're very heterodox in that sense, where they will take certain Wahhabi or Salafi influenced scholars and really focus on those people and then build their foundation from that point on. But let's not pretend that these are kind of theological, dabblers. That may be true for the people who fight for ISIS or some of the European Muslims who go to fight for ISIS, but I'd be careful about saying that's true of most people in ISIS or the ISIS leadership in particular.
In 30 seconds, what is the practical application of what you have just said in the case of Turkish Islamists?
The practical application. So in the Imam Hatib schools, look, I think it's always better to err on the side of more inclusion than less as a kind of issue of principle. And perhaps that will help with some people. But I think sometimes there's a risk if you try to promote, and this is sometimes what the US tries to do, it tries to promote this kind of moderate Islam, which is never going to be compelling to anyone who's vaguely sympathetic to jihadi Salafism. If you want to convince people who are somewhat predisposed in that direction, you have to come at them with serious theological arguments that draw on the Salafi school.
I have exactly 5 minutes left, please.
I'm a retired Foreign Service officer. I have a question directed initially to Dr. Cordesman, but it's for all of you. And it's to move this conversation to get back to the strategic level once again and ask you to address the national security threat in Syria and Iraq of Daesh or ISIS and how one best responds to that both on the part of regional actors as well as external actors. And the underlying assumption is that there is unlikely to be any significant military, significant, efficient presence of boots on the ground forthcoming from any quarter. And absent that, what does one do? Is it a containment policy, perhaps with modest train and equip, perhaps with air support? But where do we go from here in terms of an overall strategic approach to the question?
It isn't just military. One of the keys is that you now have essentially the equivalent of a counterterrorism train and assist group in virtually every major embassy in the region. You are working with internal security forces and counterterrorism forces. You're dealing with the financial side. I have not seen, but others on the panel may commented on it, really that effective a U.S. effort at strategic communications. And I think you raised a lot of the issues involved. In terms of the actual military effort, a lot of the bombing effort in Syria is directed at ISIS targets, either to get to the leadership, key cadres, or the economic sources of activity. It is not at a level where it is going to be decisive. It would take a really major increase in the air campaign and the willingness to inflict significant civilian casualties to actually do that. The train and assist mission, the effort in Iraq, was stated fairly clearly at the start as 2 to 3 years to create 9 to 12 effective brigades, because you're not dealing with that large a military movement in ISIS. The estimates are somewhere between 22,000 and 32,000 volunteers. If it had not been for the civil war in Iraq that was going on when ISIS came in, this should never have happened. Maliki had to destroy the Iraqi army to basically enable ISIS. But remember, containment remains critical. It is containing volunteers going in, it's containing people going out, it's dealing with the movements between them. But also remember that with all this focus on the Islamic State, the Khorasan group, Al-Qaeda in the al-Nusra Front, Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the other groups are as meaningful a threat of terrorism as the Islamic State is. And strategically, unlike some of the commentary that only focuses on the Islamic State, we have to deal with violent extremism everywhere it's located.
Okay. I have exactly 2 minutes. I'm going to give you one, and I'm going to give Burhanettin one.
You can try and contain it, but the problem we have is inside of that durable safe haven, we have a war between, for lack of a better way of putting it, Iranian-backed forces and Sunni-backed forces, right? And there's an increase in sectarianism. That is a generator of extremism on both sides of that war. And so the question is, how does that really threaten us? Well, A, it grows in number. B, that could lead to organized terrorist attacks like we saw on September 11th. Hopefully it doesn't happen again. But also lone wolf terrorist attacks, or whatever you want to call them. We don't know the political fallout of that yet. We don't know how Americans are going to react to it. But I think the one thing that's looming there is, does the specter of large swaths of the Syrian Sunni population getting mowed down by an Iranian-backed regime going on in the future, does the loss in that area, or even of a part of Syria, does that have blowback in other Sunni countries in terms of their leadership structure? I.e., could ISIS use that as a way to foment revolution in countries in the Arab Gulf or even beyond? And that would threaten a lot of our strategic oil supplies and other aspects, but I think this is a more distant question.
Okay, great. Now, we started off talking about Turkey, so I would like to round off with Turkey. Now, looked at from Ankara, what do you think the Turks see, Erdogan and others? Do they see that they just have to bide their time until the storm is gone and they could still reap the benefits of the so-called Arab Spring, or is this a more permanent setback for the Turks?
In Syria and Iraq, there are serious problems, so you cannot wait. And Turkey is trying to face the challenges, the problems coming out of from these two failed states and the ISIL presence and the growing Shia militias. So there is no waiting for time. And they are trying to solve this issue, these problems, issue-based, dealing with Saudi Arabia or the United States or the Iraqi Kurdistan and others. So Syrian refugees and other security issues are so big problems for Turkey. Turkey is not the US in these issues.
And with that, I call an end to this panel. Thank you very much to all the panelists, Andrew, Tony, Shadi, and Burhanettin. Thank you all very much. Thank you so much. That was great.